everyone from all over the world for joining us today. We really appreciate it, these opportunities to come together across the sector. Before we get started, I'm just going to check in with Sarah and Peter that we've got the recording underway. And if not, let's get that started before we launch in. Great, fantastic, thank you. Okay, everyone, before we start, just a few housekeeping things on our side. So as you can see here, your audio and video are actually disabled given the number of participants today. But please do make use of the chat function, as many of you are. You can post questions in the Q&A function at any time. Thank you to those of you who submitted your questions in advance. We will today have a good section of time on for a moderated discussion. So please do share those questions at any moment so we can make sure they're reflected in the discussion. And just a reminder that the session is being recorded. There was a lot of interest in today's webinar, and so please do reassure friends and colleagues if they weren't able to access today, as there is a limit of 500 participants, but please do reassure them that they can access the webinar recording afterwards, and we'll be sure to share that with all of you as well as the wider network. And the recording and presentations will be available on the INEE website afterwards. And just to point out that you'll see there is the chat function and there is the Q&A function, and they're slightly different. So if you do have a question for the discussion section of today's webinar, please do put that in the Q&A, and please use the chat function more for your comments and reflections and perhaps sharing tools and resources that you may have. But we'll do our very best to monitor both. Okay, let's get started. So Hannah, if you could just move to the next slide. Thank you. So hi everyone, again, welcome today. My name's Charlotte Bergen. I lead capacity building here at INEE, the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies. And we really want to prioritise at the moment supporting our network and EIE colleagues in their incredible efforts to continue to provide education in emergencies in light of the current global pandemic. This is the third webinar in a series that we're running based on focusing on COVID-19 and education in emergencies. And the topic today is distance learning during COVID-19. So really looking at continuing education in low tech and low resource environments in which we're so often working with education in emergencies. So really thinking about how we can keep programming in the face of the health crisis, school closures, and the restrictions on movement. And so that will be the focus of today. And we really wanted to prioritise this because we heard loud and clear from all of you and all of our members that this was such an important issue at this time. Before I go into the agenda and our fantastic speakers today, I would just like to hand over to Dean Brooks, our director here at INEE, to do a more formal welcome for us today. Thank you, Dean.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We really do have members from around the world today. As Charlotte has mentioned, this is our third webinar in a series. The previous webinars are available online, so if you haven't had a chance to listen to those, I'd encourage you to do so. And also really stay tuned for follow-on webinars. To set us off, I just want to emphasize that as a community of practice, we want to see education continue. We want to ensure its continuity. We want to build on the gains made in education in emergencies over the years. And for that reason, today's topic is so important so that we can continue to ensure children, young people, everyone has access to the right to education. And to really let you know that for INEE and its membership, the minimum standards for education in emergencies are really the critical starting point. And you can find those on the INEE website at inee.org. I don't want to delay us any longer. This is such an important topic. So I'm going to hand over now, but thank you everyone for taking time to join us this morning.
Thanks so much, Dean. Really appreciate it. Okay, let's move to the next slide, Hannah. So just to give you a quick sense of what we're going to be looking at today, we're really conscious that distance learning is quite a broad area, and we hope today will be sort of the first conversation around this and that this will continue. So we're going to start with sort of an overview and framing, and Jackie Strecker joins us from UNHCR to provide that. And then we'll be following that with a series of hopefully very practical presentations with examples of programming in this type of work. And we've got a great range of speakers for you today. So we'll be hearing from Luke Stannard at Save the Children around interactive audio instruction and interactive radio instruction. We'll hear from Abigail Bakuveles, I hope I'm saying that right, Abby, who joins us from Sesame Workshop to look more at mass media. We'll then be handing over to Camilla Lodi at NRC, who will be looking at an area that many of you raised in the questions around providing PSS support by distance learning and looking at apps and mobile technology. We'll also hear from our colleagues Judith Flick and Laura Miller at War Child Holland about more focused on games and use of tablets and so on. We'll hear from Lauren Lickman, who joins us from Learning Equality, who'll be able to share a bit more around platforms that can be used during this time. And then lastly, Mark West joins us from UNESCO to share some reflections on the work UNESCO are doing around distance learning. So a varied panel. There'll be quick fire presentations, hopefully covering a range of topics that are relevant to all of you today. And then we'll be following that, bringing all our panelists together for a moderated discussion and Q&A to really get into some of the more of the detail around those critical questions that you've raised with us, both before the webinar and during the webinar. So that's our plan for today, but as Dean said, we've got a packed agenda, so I don't want to take up too much more time. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Jackie at UNHCR, and really grateful for you joining us, Jackie. And Jackie has been doing this for some time in refugee communities, thinking about connected learning, so we really appreciate your reflections, Jackie, to start us off today. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Charlotte, and thank you to INEE for hosting these really important webinars in this series. As noted, today we're going to start talking about distance learning, and if we go to the next slide, we'll see that there are many different terms that are often used. Distance learning, sometimes we're hearing ministries refer to virtual learning. At UNHCR, we talk about connected education or connected learning as a way of emphasizing more the connections being made between people and knowledge. But overall, this webinar is going to focus on ways to leverage technology to support continuous learning during COVID. And I want to note at the beginning that technology is not a silver bullet. I think we all know this by now, but it is a tool, and it's a tool amongst many other tools that we need to consider and need to think thoughtfully around how we could use it. So what you'll hear from within this webinar, which builds off of the other webinars, as Dean mentioned, is how we can unpack the use of different technologies and different tools and how they could be applied to support COVID responses. So what's important to acknowledge here are that there are many diverse models, approaches, and resources that can be used. Normally, in my day-to-day advocacy around connected education, I focus on facility models that emphasize the social dimension of learning. So these often take places actually within schools or within community centers. And the reason why we prioritize these are because much of the research has shown that these models, when using also a blended approach, which is a blend of face-to-face interaction along with online learning, can actually contribute to greater learning outcomes than traditional face-to-face models. However, facility approaches aren't the most appropriate when we're looking at a COVID context, and especially when social distancing is being recommended or enforced. But there are resources within these facilities and different models that could be leveraged. And so this is also what's important to look at. There's a whole range of distance learning models that also place an emphasis on differentiated learning options, as well as self-guided learning options. And these are particularly interesting in today's context. And you'll hear more about these from our panelists. And just as there's different models, there's also a whole range of different tools that can be used. And several of those were mentioned. They include both high-tech, low-tech options, but also should be considered with no-tech solutions. So as you hear these examples, we want you to have a few considerations in mind. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see some of these considerations here. So the first one being, what is the national response? What education materials are being made available to support continuous learning? And in what ways are these resources being distributed? So we've seen some ministries work with radio broadcasting We've seen others who are working with mobile operators to provide free access to online learning platforms. What's happening within your context? The next important consideration is equity. We do need to work, as we always do, with a do no harm approach. And it's very important to consider here who has access and who doesn't. We all know educational equity is a consistent tension within our regular education provision. There are many children and youth who are left out of education, but it's our responsibility as resources are being made available as part of the COVID response to ensure and to look for ways that we can support the distribution of these materials to some of the most marginalized learners. And this might take different approaches. So we might need to think about offline resources or different technologies or different approaches to reach them. So in order to do this, it's important that you understand who has access and what do they have access to. Do people have radios? Do they have mobile phones? In the case of if you're working with refugees, do they have legal access to SIM cards? And within these questions, it's important to look at who has access. Is it only the parents? Do children actually get opportunities to leverage these devices? It's also important to consider what are the levels of literacy? What about digital literacy? What about for parents, for teachers, for learners? It's also important that we consider how we can mix and match some of these solutions or approaches. So it might not just be investing in one mode of distribution or one resource, but actually looking for a multi-pronged approach so we can reach the most individuals. And so with this in mind, it's also important to look at how you can sequence your response. You might put in place something in the immediate, which could even be worksheets, radio broadcasting programs, but as things start to move into a medium-term response, children remain out of school for a longer period of time, what other options could be used? Could you look at mobile and sending short lessons, digital exercises, for example? Again, these approaches don't have to be used as one-off, but could be used within a mix and match. And so as you listen to our panelists later on today, it's important for you to consider how can these different resources be leveraged in your context? And is there a sequencing that could be put into place? It's also really important to think about as you're looking at either provisioning new equipment or repurposing existing materials or resources you have, how these can contribute to a long-term investment. So how can these resources support, for example, catch-up classes or accelerated education programs once schools are returning? How can these resources that might be distributed to families be shared community resources and reallocated to schools or libraries, again, once society resumes? How also can the recovery of the school system when schools are starting up again, how can these resources and these programs that we've put into place be integrated into that recovery system? So used not only to support continuous learning now, but also to support ways that as schools are being restarted to support additional remedial classes or additional learning in their resumption. In addition to the above, it's important to consider how and what the longer term costs of some of the decisions that we make are now. So for example, we've seen many content providers who have kindly offered free access to education resources or platforms during COVID. Now, while this is a very gracious offer and should be considered, it's important to look at how we could actually move towards open licensing of educational content and how content could be made interoperable so that radio broadcasts could also be available in offline formats or shared via mobile phone. Same with a number of different educational material. How can we also ensure protection of data? So ensuring that people don't have to share personal information in order to be able to access these education platforms and content. So these are important considerations that we need to think through now as we're making those choices, and particularly for those that are working with ministries or working with systems and thinking through these decision-making processes. Because while this might be a short, quick response, it can have lasting implications. So I hope these considerations ring a bell with you and are things that are already part of your decision-making process. I know INEE and many of the partners both on the call today and both as panelists and that are joining in listening have issued additional guidance, and these resources are available on the INEE website or links to other sites. And so there's many considerations to take into account, and I know sometimes it can be overwhelming, but hopefully these initial considerations will help you as you listen to the panelists today to think about, looking at these practical examples, how can distance learning be applied in your context and help to support? So with that, I'll turn it back over to Charlotte and to our panelists. But just to say, I think this is a very important discussion and appreciate everyone joining in today. And I think we're all in this together and willing to support one another in finding the right solution so we can ensure education continues. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jackie. I think, yeah, really important considerations there. Great for us to keep those in mind today, and they really do chime with the questions we've been getting here at INEE from our members, particularly around concerns around equity, for example, and also thinking about the long-term impact of this more immediate programming. So thank you so much for flagging those. Hopefully we'll touch on them today in the presentations and the discussion, and we can also chat and consider some follow-up webinars to perhaps dig in a little deeper on some of these issues. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to the first of our presentations. I'm going to pass to Luke at Save the Children, who's going to talk to us more around audio and radio options. Thank you so much for joining us, Luke. Over to you.
Thank you. Hello everyone, hi, I will be brief. Today, just very briefly looking at interactive audio instruction, which is used interchangeably with interactive radio instruction, though there is some difference. I just think the framing from Jacqueline was fantastic, really, and should be thought about throughout all of these examples. According to statistics, which we all know there can be issue with that, UNESCO estimates that 75% of households globally have access to a radio. One of the great things about interactive audio instruction is the considerable implementation options that this provides. Obviously, when we think interactive radio, we tend to jump to a broadcast radio option, whereas there's obviously opportunities to distribute MP3s, to work with telecommunications companies and so forth, but also to work with community radio and so forth. And we'll talk through an example that uses a multi-implementation option in a minute. These two phrases, interactive audio instruction, for those who haven't engaged before, and interactive radio instruction, can be used interchangeably, though there is a difference, but perhaps that's not for now. I think what's significant about interactive audio instruction and interactive radio instruction in particular is that it's a multi-child learning material, in the respect that one-to-one devices, though fantastic for adapting to the child's input or the learner's input and so forth, and provide an individualized learning pathway for children. Interactive audio instruction is broadcast from a radio, from a mobile phone, and is more likely to encourage a multi-child learning opportunity, which can help with some of the gender disparities and other intersectional issues that can be a problem with single devices. Very briefly at the bottom, we've got what is just a brief skeleton of a program that we're looking to introducing at Save the Children, just to represent how it can be interactive. There are different sections. We're focusing social emotional learning quite a great bit, as I'm sure people can imagine, but this allows potentially to pause and stop the recording, as well as to provide pauses within the broadcast. So that's how it can be interactive, and we believe it can be, and it has evidence to be a very social activity. If we could just go to the next slide, please. Okay, very brief example, the Tiende program in Malawi. This has been going for about 7 years now. It's more of a development project in its scope, but has been and will continue to be used and shifted towards an emergency response. The the fantastic part of this program, there's lots of that, but one of them in particular is that this is early childhood development material that works for children as well as with volunteers as well. It involves 100 pre-recorded lessons that follow a similar structure, so that it provides that the reassurance of a similar structure, and also helps trainee volunteers who are learning to improve their ECD delivery skills. It shows a common structure within lessons and so forth, and that's something that is emulated a lot across a great deal of positive, good quality interactive radio and audio instruction. It's tied with the national curriculum, which we appreciate is a massive part of ensuring long-term continuity in their education provision. It's been distributed through a multimodal distribution structures. So we've got mobile phones, the likes of which, it doesn't have to be a smartphone, to solar radio distribution, to self-powered radio, but also from community radio, which are much smaller but somewhat more reliable sometimes. And then you've got national radio distribution, which often, especially in emergency context, doesn't actually can fail to reach some of the areas where people are displaced within. So you have to consider the difference in how we distribute that medium. To put it into perspective, this particular program in Malawi, 800,000 children engaged with it, have been engaged with it, and that's roughly about 10 cents per child. So it offers a very good value for money when it comes, and radio is sometimes overlooked in that respect. And there's a great deal of effort going on with USAID and so forth to collate those resources, but the most important thing going forward is to make sure that it's appropriate to the given context, and that we think about those medium-term to long-term goals of how this material can be integrated within the wider education system. But yeah, I'll stop that.
Wonderful, thanks so much, Luke. Really, yeah, so helpful and practical for participants today. We know that many of you raised radio instruction as a key area of work, so hope that has been helpful for you today, and we'll be able to dig in a little deeper in the Q&A. Thank you, Luke. So I'll now hand over to Abby, who joins us from Sesame Workshop. Thanks so much for joining us today, Abby, and for helping us learn a little more around mass media and television and what's possible there. Thank you. Over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today and to present just a little bit about Sesame Workshop's mass media approach and what we're generally trying to do when we're reaching children who aren't necessarily in the classroom. So I'm going to try to talk pretty briefly about a couple of sort of key elements of what Sesame Workshop does. And one is, of course, mass media, as I'm sure everyone is expecting. And the other is around caregiver engagement. So beginning with mass media, when we enter a space, what we're trying to think about is how can we support children who might not have equal access to early schooling. Sesame Workshop was really started, Sesame Street was initially conceptualized as this idea that mass media afforded an opportunity to give children a chance to succeed and to enter school ready for success when not everyone had the same access to equal preschool education. And it started in the US, but of course has expanded overseas in many different ways. So when we're thinking about mass media, whether we're thinking about a television approach or a radio approach, some of the things that we always have very much in mind are how can we have a very clear curriculum with clear measurable outcomes so we know if our content is successful. And we do our best to engage multiple stakeholders in the target region, whether that's a country or a more specific area or a set of countries, to make sure that everything that we develop is supporting national curriculum efforts and is representative of the needs on the ground. We also have to think about access to media platforms among the target population. And that's just really asking, how many people have access to television at home? How many people have access to television in the community? How many people have access to a radio at home? All of those key questions. And more, of course, we're asking about access to devices. And, if there is a device within the family, what are the chances of a child being able to use that device to access educational content? So we really always have to think about, how does that curriculum and the platform, how do they line up with one another? And a really simple example is that certain aspects of early literacy are difficult to teach by radio. Other aspects, not so much. But if you're thinking about, for example, what a letter looks like when you write it on paper, that doesn't necessarily translate so well to radio content. So those are the things that those are the ways that the platform and the curriculum influence one another. And then finally, as I referenced earlier, and I'll talk about a little bit more in just a moment, it's really important to think about how can our content engage caregivers, whether those are parents or educators, to support their children's learning. So a quick example is our program in Afghanistan, which is called Bachi Simsim. We've had this program running now for several years. I believe we're in the 7th year right now of broadcast, and we have television and radio, as well as some specific types of community engagement. So the television program is broadcast, as many of you might imagine, primarily in Kabul because of access to TV. We also, though, have really incredible radio reach because of high ownership of household radio and community radio stations. So we actually partner with community radio stations all over Afghanistan to deliver content to families who are at home, and often to families where children are they just don't have much access to early schooling. And so that's not necessarily due to an emergency, it's just sort of due to the reality and what it's like to access schooling on the ground. Finally, we use those radio programs, we use the different radio episodes to run listening circles for mother-child dyads. And what that basically means is that groups of mothers and children come together to community center, and they listen to a radio program together and have a facilitated experience around, discussing the radio and what they learn from the radio, and then engaging with their children in other types of learning activities. So I'll go to the next slide now. In terms of involving caregivers in learning, what we're thinking about is, where are children accessing our content? Are they using it at home or at school or in the community? And who are the key adults in their lives? So of course, when we're thinking about access to school in this particular context, when we think about distance learning, it really what we're thinking about is how can we support low resource schools and educators who may not have had a ton of formal training opportunities before entering the classroom. In terms of the key adults in children's lives, we're generally assuming that it's home-based caregivers, whether those are parents or other relatives or family members or friends or whatever, wherever these kids are spending most of their days when they're not in school, as well as the educators and the community service members that they might have access to. And then we're thinking about, what is the reality of these adults? What do they need? How can we support them in helping children get the most out of our Sesame content and to have the most meaningful learning opportunities possible? So we know from a lot of needs assessment work that we've done around the world that often when caregivers, particularly parents, have lower levels of formal educational achievement, they feel less equipped to support their children's learning. And we also know from a lot of brain development research that that's simply not true. So really quickly, just a few examples of how we address that. One I already discussed through Bachi Simsim, those listening circles we feel are really key for helping mothers to realize that they can support their children's learning, and for encouraging co-listening. So really making sure that kids and parents are listening to radio together. The way that we do that in terms of the radio episode format is that there's a section for children, there's a section for parents, and then there's a section for truly for co-listening or family listening. And so anytime you listen to an episode, those 3 elements are there to encourage engagement among the whole family. Sesame Shiko Shiko is a very new program that is actually adapting from the content from Afghanistan for use in with Somali language speakers in Ethiopia and in other countries in the Horn of Africa. So one of the things that we're looking at is, how can we use that content in the classroom to support educators who are working with Somali children who maybe are struggling, or they don't have access to a lot of media content in their own language, in their home language. And so we're leveraging that content with teacher training guides, and we're providing teachers with very simple training guides to support how they facilitate children's interaction with media content. So that could be a simple television episode, it could be a simple radio episode, but regardless, we know that teachers aren't always accustomed to using media in the classrooms. And so we try to provide, fairly low text and image-based and clear ideas and instructions and tips for getting the most out of media when you're using it in the classroom. And then finally, I just wanted to reference a program called Play Every Day, which was funded by the LEGO Foundation across 3 countries. We ran it, I believe, from 2016 through early 2019. And the reason this program is worth noting is because we began with a needs assessment in terms of how can we really support meaningful interactions between parents and children, so between children's primary caregiver and the child themselves. And one of the things that came out repeatedly is just the need to remind parents, to remind caregivers that they are their child's first educator, their child's most important educator, and that they don't need to be able to afford high cost resources to support their children's learning. And it was really just sort of one of the main things that we wanted to do was to build sort of parental attitudes and sense of efficacy around supporting their children's learning. So that's kind of a key element when we're thinking about, if we're having a little bit of a one-way communication through mass media, it's really, really key to make sure, we know that kids are going to get the most out of this content if the adults in their lives are also engaging. And so we have to make sure that adults feel, that they are equipped and they have the skill set that they need to support their children's learning. So I'll stop there, and thank you so much, and looking forward to questions.
Thanks so much, Abby. Again, really appreciate those some practical examples and particularly those considerations around caregivers. Yeah, thanks so much to the panelists for already touching on so many of the considerations that Jackie raised for us at the beginning. Okay, fantastic. So we're ready to move on to the next presentation. So Hannah, if you could move on the next slide. And Camilla, if I could ask Camilla from NRC, who joins us from the Middle East region, to hand over to you, Camilla. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Charlotte, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening from my home in Amman to everybody. So I'm currently covering the role of psychosocial support and social emotional learning advisor in the Mero region, and overseeing what NRC calls the Better Learning Program, which is a psychosocial support and social emotional learning program provided to children in conflict affected areas and who are going to schools, formal schools and non-formal school settings. So just to give you a flavor of this incredible program, it's based on these 5 principles that many of you who are working psychosocial support may know from Hopeful, but it's basically based on the principles of being able to calm down, acquiring a sense of stability and safety, having the power to change the situation, connecting with the others, and reestablishing hope. And in this weird period that we're all going through and living, of course, these 5 principles resonate in terms of principles that can be applied not only for children, but also for adults. So what is NRC doing? At headquarters level, basically they've pulled together an emergency remote learning guidance, which is a 10-pager providing the different type of new programs, audio, TV, self-directed learning materials, online activities, to provide guidance to the different country offices. In Lebanon, colleagues have started collecting data on learning readiness of children and their well-being. So calling them and their parents and finding out, how are you today? What are you able to learn? we are continuing providing support to through the supporters, a group that has been established through a very interesting work done with a couple of clinical psychologists, providing self-care, and now we're looking into remote practices. In Syria, we're also looking at providing psychosocial support messages through very simple flyers, WhatsApp messages that are provided to teachers and parents. If we move on to the next slide, today I'm going to focus on a mobile application. I still see the first slide. Anyhow, yes, here it is. So this is an application that was actually first started to be implemented in Myanmar, and now we have been using it with some teachers in Jordan, in refugee camps and host communities. So basically it's an application designed to complement the Better Learning Program skills and techniques that are provided to teachers, parents, to enhance well-being of children. And basically it's an offline application for Android devices, for phones and tablets, available at the moment in 3 different languages: Myanmar, English and Arabic. And in these days, I also downloaded on my phone. And it contains 3 chapters. Basically, it looks into the principles of the better learning that I just mentioned earlier on. So teachers and parents, looks into in ways of supporting teachers and parents, and it also has a quiz, a test after each section. So basically, through applying this in the next slide, it has interactive videos. It refreshes children, teachers and parents' minds in terms of what was learned inside classrooms, and just refreshing ideas on how to reiterate those techniques that help us in these difficult moments, on breathing, relaxation, tense and release, that help improving well-being. And there are some practical videos. So right now, because Better Learning Program started in a few number of schools in Gaza and expanded to 13 countries across the globe, we are now looking into, specifically in the region, to institutionalizing the Better Learning Program internally and also externally across Ministry of Education schools in Jordan, Lebanon, and Palestine, hoping that by the end of our multi-year project, this will become an open source public good that can then be shared with a set of capacity building procedures and minimum standards to be put in place once we apply the Better Learning Program. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Camilla. And thanks to all the panelists for keeping things so speedy and pacey for us today. You raised such important points for us there. Just to say that many of the questions we received ahead of the webinar did relate to providing psychosocial support and social emotional learning via distance modalities. So I really appreciate you touching on that there, as well as support to teachers. And just to let participants know that we are planning to have a dedicated webinar looking at PSSS and SEL next week, and the week after looking at support to teachers specifically. So more on those topics, but really appreciate the important points and examples you gave us there, Camilla. Thank you. Okay, so on to our next panelist. Hopefully you're hearing lots of different ideas here for your own work. I'm going to hand over to Judith and Laura now, who join us from War Child Holland, where they've been working with Can't Wait to Learn. Thank you both. I'll hand over to you. Oh, Judith, I can't hear you. Can we just check your sound?
Let me try it this way. Is
Perfect.
that best?
Thank you. Yeah, great.
Yeah. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you. I wanted to start by thanking you for bringing us together. I think it's really important to exchange these experiences. And, you know, it's really interesting to hear all the different examples. I'm the program director of Can't Wait to Learn program, which I'll explain briefly. And I'm joined by Laura Miller, who is the interim regional representative for War Child in the Middle East. So Can't Wait to Learn is a cost-effective and highly efficient digital tables-based innovation program that provides children access to quality education in formal and informal settings, and actually developed for children in very difficult circumstances, children affected by conflict, children on the move. And this is why a lot of communities have reached out to us immediately when COVID hit, to see if we could adapt this or we could use this under present circumstances. It offers children an opportunity to continue to learn to read and write and count through a self-paced digital game, which is specifically created to reflect their world and context. It's actually co-designed with children in countries, so it really reflects their world and it resonates with them. We work in partnership with the Ministry of Education always, and it's based on a national curriculum. So one of your considerations, of course, is we take into consideration. And very often we work also in partnerships, and a number of the speakers here are some of our partners. Children's progress is monitored and used for further improvements of the program, so there's also a research aspect to it. Currently we implement this in Jordan, Lebanon, Sudan, Uganda, Chad and Bangladesh in different modalities. Maybe we go to the next page and then I can explain how we are thinking of adapting this to the present situation. So in the present situation, we are facing a number of challenges with the present setup. Because in the present setup, children actually come together, so there's some social interaction between the children, but also the facilitators. That's obviously not possible with a total lockdown. Also, the facilitators, see the children on a sort of a regular basis. So therefore, we thought of 3 adaptations. One is to use the videos that we already have of this game and make a downloadable link of this, and that can be done and realized in 3 weeks' time and make available to children in a very widely spread in Arabic and in English. Another adaptation would be, and that could also be quite immediately available, is to increase the amount of tablets. So at the moment, the game is actually played on tablets, as you can see in the first picture. But under present circumstances, you would need a ratio of 1 tablet per child, and not at a center where they handed these tablets, but at home. So that would be a possibility, but not in all environments, because it might not be safe, and the equity consideration might apply here and not, not apply here actually. And then the third one is that we're adapting the game that is in the moment delivered on downloaded on a tablet to children in a way that they could actually play it on their mobile phones. And this could be ready, let's say, in 3 months' time, the first batch, and then for the full game language Arabic would be 4.5 months. So that's still a long time if you think about it as an immediate emergency response. But we think that COVID might actually, in waves, still stay with us, and it's also good preparation for future possible emergencies. So it could be, in the long term, a very good investment for this. I quickly wanted to go through your considerations and see how this applies to this before I give the word to Laura. So linked to national curriculum, of course, is there. It's totally developed with them, and actually they requested us to support them. The equity consideration, I already said, that is an issue and needs to be monitored. So who has access to mobile phones, who has access to this tablets, and the downloadable link might actually be the best solution in that respect. The sequencing of the response is definitely something we take into consideration, because there are different options, and also the different options that we offer, you know, might apply in different contexts better than others. Like I said, these are solutions that can also be applied in future. So the investments that we make and are being made are lasting. And children can actually continue doing this after the event, when they come together again. I'd like to give the word to Laura, who is on the ground in Jordan and can speak to how you know, they're preparing actually to applying some of these solutions.
Thanks, Judith, and hi to everyone. Hello from Amman. I apologize, my camera is not working. I think it's overworked on all of the recent Zoom conversations, so I'm not able to share my or video with you, so I'm sorry about that. I think one interesting point I might add to Judith's explanation is that the original design of the Can't Wait to Learn serious game applications was for offline access. So really an offline application that was downloaded onto tablets that children could physically then, you know, access in their community centers or their child-friendly spaces, for example, and sometimes in catch-up education or even accelerated learning settings. And now one of the reasons that that was decided was to overcome the issue of reliance on internet for access to education in very remote settings, for example. We can think about Eastern Chad, for example, or Northern Uganda, where Can't Wait to Learn is active and where internet connection is unreliable. And that's been one of the interesting challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic, where we see a fast change to reliance on the internet, and often then as well, especially in the Jordan context, I think many of the Middle Eastern countries experience the same, the lack of time to pre-position assets or materials, whether written materials or things like tablets where children could access learning material directly on a device at home. So there is a reliance now on devices that children might already have at home and internet connection. And that is where Can't Wait to Learn is now working very closely in Jordan and Lebanon, for example, with the Ministry of Education to adapt the content to make it available in a way that children can also experience the full instructional model. So instructions on the competency that they're working on, as well as then be able to replicate activities in the home setting. So I think we are also looking very differently, and it could be a very different response in Africa or Latin America, for example, where the COVID pandemic is at an earlier stage than what it is now in the Middle East, and where pre-positioning of tablets might be able to take place, for example, before people are put under curfew or required to stay at home. So I think for me, that's all I would add, also keeping an eye on the time. Also looking forward to the questions a bit later.
Thank you so much, Judith and Laura. Oops, sorry, Judith, were you?
Yeah, maybe one more thing. So there's a question we get a lot. What about the teachers? There is already under the Can't Wait to Learn program a way of supporting the teachers, you know, through Facebook page, through webinars, and through education learning circles where they can actually support each other. And that can be continued also under these circumstances, but then remotely.
Great, thanks, Judith. Yeah, also always so important to be emphasising the critical role of teachers in all of this. So important to be championing them. Thank you. And thank you for those reflections on, particularly as we think about how things need to be adapted in light of COVID-19. Really appreciate that insight. And thanks to all the participants for raising such brilliant questions. Thank you for your patience. We will be coming to the Q&A very soon. So we are noting these questions and look forward to the discussion. But I'm now going to hand over to Lauren at Learning Equity, who will be able to speak more. A few of you have had questions around platforms and connectivity and so on. She'll be able to speak to that, as this notion of digital divide is very important to the mandate of learning equality. So thanks for joining us, Lauren.
Great, thanks, Charlotte, and hi, everyone. Hope you're all doing well during these uncertain times. I think you'll hear a lot of the themes in what I have to share similar to what the Can't Wait to Learn team has shared. Just before I go on, Charlotte, do you have my slides, or Hannah, to move on to the next? Great, thank you. So similarly, as Charlotte mentioned, at Learning Equality, we've developed a product and an ecosystem called Calibri because we deeply care about equity. We've always been focused on reaching the most marginalized, and in light of this current pandemic, those communities are even harder to reach, and we recognize the equity gap will widen. The issues that we've always been working to address, such as limited or unreliable internet, limited hardware or infrastructure, limited time for discoverability of quality relevant resources, or even a general lack of openly available relevant digital materials, are becoming increasingly apparent as we move towards these distance learning solutions in response to the current pandemic. So Calibri is our open source learning platform that's the center of an ecosystem to provide offline access to a curated and openly licensed educational content library with tools for pedagogical support for differentiated and personalized learning. It's specifically designed for use in low resource and low connectivity contexts. And like its predecessor, KLite, it's designed to run on low cost and legacy hardware devices to support different pedagogical models. Similar to Can't Wait to Learn, it's designed for offline first and uniquely has a distribution and access model that responds to the needs in these lower connectivity contexts. In general, our model is to create mini learning hubs where tools and support to educators that are often made available online are now made available offline, with considerations given for lower resource contexts. But similarly, our designs were generally oriented around contexts where there would be social interaction at some point. So even if one is learning by oneself, we anticipated and designed for a use case where there would be a central societal point to update content or sync data for educators to review and provide more personalized support. Obviously, that's not the case now. And so if you move on to the next slide, I can share a bit more about what we're doing. So we're currently making available what we've always had, which is Calibri and its content library in various languages for different grade levels and subjects. Additionally, we're making available our Calibri Studio curricular tool that helps to support the alignment of digital resources to curricular standards. But what's new about what we're doing, or what's coming soon, is the first and foremost, and I think the biggest takeaway that responds to a lot of the questions posed, is we've already been sharing guidance and documentation on how to use Calibri at home for continued learning. So what are the moments when Calibri makes sense for learners, and what are some pedagogical resources that can help to support learning? So this includes documentation for educators on how to facilitate using WhatsApp or other messaging services by taking content within our library and then sharing it along with some pedagogical guidance. We've also developed documentation on how to make choice boards for self-directed learning or self-guided lesson templates. We've also been enhancing the learning platform, and we're currently working on releasing in the next few weeks a self-contained Android app that would support organizational provisioning of devices, as well as improving the onboarding process to support a more self-directed use case. We're also providing a catalog to help improve the discoverability of content in our library, and also expanding our library on some of the topics that we've all been discussing related to public and mental health, pedagogical resources to support parents at home for learners, specific languages where the pandemic is especially severe, and the ability to take radio and television content and distribute it in a new way to allow for more self-paced learning. We were also developing deeper documentation on how to use our curricular tool for alignment to national curricula, as well as providing additional support to pre-provisioned devices for distribution and technical guidance to mobile network operators and governments on how to host an online instance of Calibri, which especially makes sense if and is valuable if content is already aligned to the curricula. If we move on to the next slide, there's two examples that I wish to highlight that of what's been done so far in light of COVID response. The first is a government response, and this is the National IT Authority in Uganda has made Calibri available via hotspots in Kampala and Entebbe and online across the country with support from Uganda and the national curricular body. What's unique about this is that the content that's on the Calibri platform has already been vetted by the curricular body and is organized according to the national curricula. And when this online server is used in collaboration with some of the documentation that I mentioned earlier, it can help to support both educators and learners in a self-directed fashion. On the right side, I'm sharing an example that's a bit more grassroots. An organization that we support called Elimu has been working in Kenya already with Calibri, and they have content that they've aggregated according to the national curricula. But what's unique here is that they've been making it available to their community by connecting a server to a newly created mesh network using boosters. So totally locally led, but now others within their community can access Calibri. One last note is that we've talked a lot about supporting learners with disabilities, and Calibri itself is designed to have a plug-in architecture so that other plug-in tools and devices can be used along with the platform. In the server that's being hosted in Uganda, actually some of the content is designed for inclusive education, and it contains more accessible EPUBs to support learners with special needs. So just thought I would mention that in light of some of the comments so far. But I included a link here. We'll be continuing to share additional guidance and resources and updates on what we've been doing to meet needs during this time. And we really look forward to your questions to see how we can best support. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Lauren, and thanks in particular for raising that point around inclusive education at the end. Again, we will be having a follow-up webinar dedicated to inclusive education, but it's such a critical issue and challenge we know many of you are facing at the moment is ensuring that education response is truly inclusive. So more on that in the Q&A. Conscious of time, and we do want a good chunk of time for discussion, so I'm going to quickly hand over to Mark at UNESCO. Thanks for joining us today, Mark, and helping us connect sort of that global and the national work that you and colleagues at UNESCO are doing. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Charlotte, and hello, colleagues. Just wanted to say great that INEE is organizing this webinar, and though, of course, this is first and foremost a health crisis, on the UNESCO side, it is definitely an educational crisis as well. As many of you have probably seen, UNESCO started monitoring the school closures from the very beginning, and we've sort of watched with horror as these school closures have spread around the world, and now it's over 90% of enrolled school students are out of school, or approximately that. So anyway, you know, what an enormous challenge. And I wanted to sort of build on what Jackie was saying, an enormous challenge, and we're all playing catch up. But at the same time, there's a lot of what I would call forced opportunities. So opportunities certainly to make education systems more resilient, opportunities to sort of rethink equity and how education systems can be more equitable and include all students. So as with every crisis, there are opportunities as well. And I think some of the people have spoken to some of those opportunities. So I'm just going to use the rest of the sort of 5 minutes to sort of talk about some UNESCO perspectives and a little bit about what we're doing on the UNESCO side. The first slide, which has been emphasized by some other people, is just to use all the tools in your toolkit. So sort of multiple approaches. And we've seen good success with countries that have done this simultaneously, where they're rolling out high-tech, low-tech, and no-tech solutions all the time. While we, of course, have been emphasizing equity and cannot lose sight of that, it's also important to just put resources out there for people that they can pick up, whether that be through the radio, as Luke and others were mentioning, or whether that be through television broadcasting, as we've seen with the partners at Sesame Street, but basically to get these things moving, get them moving quickly so that becomes part of people's routines. And I think the points about including parents and families have been very good. And what we're seeing is that this is a lot about homeschooling, learning at home, and only in the sort of most advanced sort of situations where there's been sort of excellent planning have people been able to sort of preserve that school-based approach, class-based approach, teacher-class approach. But a lot of parts of the world, we've sort of seen that break down, where learning is being picked up in different pieces and through different platforms and different modalities. If we can maybe go to the next slide. Sorry, Charlotte, I don't know if I control that or if you do. Great. So just to talk about kind of what's happening on the UNESCO side, we're of course monitoring these school closures and have a lot of good data there. We're integrating gender desegregated data also about sort of teachers, realizing that this is of course impacting the teaching community as well. We have established these communities of practice. This is at the very highest sort of political level. We've organized a number of meetings with ministers of education. Some of those meetings attended by over 40 ministers of education, so giving them chances to share how they're planning responses and what they're doing. And that's been a really rich exchange where people are sharing perspectives and sharing solutions. We've also been organizing thematic webinars around education responses. This is also aimed at the more technical staff inside of ministries. We've held webinars around equity. We've held webinars around the gender dimensions of this. And on Thursday, we'll be holding a webinar around the aspect of examinations and how countries are handling delays to examinations and what they're planning as far as having students graduate and other things. We have a repository of national responses. So if you want to know what different countries are doing, we've collected data on that. We're also surveying ministries of education to get more data about that. We've created a repository of distance learning solutions. UNESCO has always been a bit hesitant to sort of point to actual solutions, but we wanted to do it given this sort of emergency. So there's some on-the-shelf solutions to be used there. We're providing country-level support through our network of field offices. And then, of course, we're doing data collection, research, and analysis. And finally, thinking about how this is going to change education. As we all know, life after this crisis is probably not going to be the same as life before. And that's certainly true for the educational dimensions as well. I think one thing we've seen a lot of is a distinction between education and learning, and I think that while all of us are education specialists, those distinctions are clear. I think they're becoming clear to wider audiences and to families. And then the final slide. I just wanted to also point, and many of you have probably heard about the global coalition that UNESCO has launched. We are bringing together a large number of organizations to help ensure an effective response, a coordinated response, to avoid duplication of work, and to be able to attempt big things. So I put a bunch of UNESCO resources in the chat bar, but you can sort of see what we have there. The purposes and objectives of this organization are very clear. It's to maintain the continuity of learning, especially for underprivileged youth and adults. It's to ensure that all students return to school when schools reopen. This is obviously going to be a massive and global challenge. We know that even when schools are closed for just 1 week, there's drop off and fall off. Many of these closures have been, are expected to be prolonged for months. So ensuring people get back to school is going to be a big challenge and something the coalition is focused on. So that coalition, we've seen a great outpouring of goodwill. We've got, giant companies, Amazon, Google, Facebook, but down to very sort of small players, and indeed many of the organizations that presented today are represented on the coalition. So I'll stop there, and great to have questions and answers. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Mark. Yeah, I think that was really, really helpful for everyone on the line. We are going to, and connects quite well, I think, to that initial framing from Jackie. So ties us in quite nicely as we move into the moderated discussion. Just before we do, just wanted to remind everyone that we do have the INEE resource collection. Thanks to those of you who've been sharing tools and resources in the chat. We will make sure to collate those as part of our tool and resource collecting efforts at the moment in curation for the INEE website. So thank you. There is a dedicated distance learning page, and we are having some really great conversations here at INEE about how we can make that even more useful for all of you. So we hope to be able to share an update on that soon. And just to also let you know that there is an interagency coordination effort underway at the moment to try and collate and share as many of the distance learning tools and resources that are available as possible, and kind of really specific about being conscious of things being kind of context specific. And so we had a first meeting last week, but hope to be able to share more of that effort to coordinate some of the sharing of resources with you soon. So more on that soon. And just again to reiterate, thanks for you have shared resources. We had an email just today from World Reader asking us just to remind people that there's a great resource of open digital book collections aligned to curriculum in many different languages, as well as general storybooks in dozens of languages and different resources around that. So that's just one example of the many we're receiving at the moment. So we will do our best to share these different tools and resources with you. So do keep checking the website. But let's jump into our discussion now. We've heard a great range of examples of this type of work, and let's come together around some of these key issues. So if I could ask all the panelists to turn their videos on, and we'll stop sharing the presentation. And then we'll get started. And just to say, everybody, if we don't have chance to address your particular question today, we will be following up with a FAQ document, which we'll ask our kind panelists to feed into as well, to make sure that we are capturing and addressing as many of these questions as possible. In the interest of time, I might just ask one panelist to respond. So please do jump in, panelists, if there's something you really feel it's urgently need to share. One of the big questions that was raised in the questionnaire that we shared before the webinar was around measurement, thinking about how we know if these programs are having impact, and particularly how we're measuring learning. And Luke, I just wondered if we could come to you to start with that question based on SAVE's experience in this work. Thanks, Luke.
Thanks, Charlotte. Hi. Well, I guess without wanting to be difficult, when we're looking at evaluation, we've got evaluation of process to consider, we've got accountability structures and how they can bleed over into evaluation opportunities, and then obviously learning outcomes. And I think some of the panelists discussed that, you know, depending on the nature of the crisis, there is the assessment of learning outcomes will potentially become more pertinent depending on the level of time people have spent out of school. What we're doing, especially around IRI and so forth, is using tools such as Rapid Pro and Rapid SMS, which is UNICEF put together to help provide an opportunity for parents to provide feedback on the program. That could be process evaluation, you know, are they on the right time? Is it the appropriate format and so forth? And there is that, and that's what's great about that is that can go out to a mass audience from a centralized position. Free call hotlines, which obviously we're going to use for accountability and some child protection aspects and so forth, and safeguarding aspects, but it also can provide information on that process analysis. Learning outcomes, again, we are working to build comprehension questions with parents directly, so to encourage that formative assessment on the learning material that the children are covering, which is valuable in its own right. But also potentially there's opportunities for built-in quizzes within the actual structures of the recordings or the television programs or whatever it is. And parents can then mark that down and answers could be at the end. There's an opportunity to send feedback through appropriate structures, be it WhatsApp in some parts, SMS in others, free chat, you know, it's a moving target. But formative assessment, we think, is a really important part of that, and working with parents to encourage comprehension question asking and issues around that and opportunities around that. But yeah, it's going to take lots of different approaches to see which one works best, we think, at the moment.
Thanks so much, Luke. Any of our other panelists want to jump in on that question? Please do. But if not, we perhaps will. Oh, Jackie, did you want to jump in there?
I just wanted to flag also that there's the EdTech Hub that have been looking at questions on learning outcomes, looking at monitoring, and trying to also standardize some of the indicators and processes for gaining information, looking at sort of EdTech more generally, but they also have a page that looks at the COVID response. So I'd recommend people have an opportunity to visit their page and to dive in a bit more. A lot of the pieces looking at sort of the global level and looking at trying to have more uniformity around some of these learning indicators is a work in progress and will take some time. I think there's recognition within the field that there needs to be more standardization in this regard. I think a lot of programs have looked at very specific ways of monitoring their work individually, and it's hard to compare across programs and approaches. So this is something that's ongoing, but I'd highly recommend people keep an eye out for resources coming through the EdTech Hub.
Great, thank you so much, Jackie. Okay, and perhaps what we'll do is, we know some people had specific questions around specific programs and how they're measuring learning, so we'll follow up and get back to you on those. But it's obviously such an important question for us all, and at times challenging, of course. So as these conversations evolve, we'll be sure to share updates via the INEE network. We do have some very specific questions about how we're measuring PSS and SEL outcomes, and we'll make sure to address that in next week's webinar as well. But just to another question that has also been really prioritised during the webinar and in advance of the webinar is really this question that's come up already around inclusive education, and just a request to our panellists to share any best practices they may have for ensuring that these new programmes or adapted programmes are made as inclusive as possible, including for children with disabilities. Jackie, I just wondered if we could come back to you there based on kind of you've got a great perspective of different work on this. I just wondered if you had any examples you could share.
Sure, and just to say, I mean, I think the conversation that was taking place in the chat is very relevant, that we shouldn't be looking at necessarily specific programming or specialized programming, but rather we should ensure an inclusive approach whenever we're designing sort of education responses and interventions. And so I think you've heard from a variety of the panelists today on how their approaches also take an inclusive lens to make sure that all learners are able to bring in opportunities. So from learning equality with Calibri and making sure that a platform is designed to build in assisted devices or additional resources, I think that's very important. And to looking at, you know, with War Child Holland and Can't Wait to Learn, and how you can have approaches that have text along with audio on screen, and just a variety of different approaches that can help. So I think the biggest piece here is to take an inclusive approach from the start and really ensure that as you're designing and implementing programs, you're including learners across the spectrum with all types of learning requirements from the start. So I really emphasize that. That's not to gloss over the issue. Again, I think when you look at equity, it's really important to ensure that these learners are included in the process. And if that does mean taking an extra initiative, or as you know, Mark West said, taking a mixed approach and applying a different modality, that's part, that should be step one of the process.
Thanks so much, Jackie. And again, if anyone wants to jump in with a sort of a burning addition, please do. But I'm conscious we've got a lot of questions to get through, really important issues, and as I say, we will do a dedicated webinar on that particular question. So thank you for raising it. I'd like to ask a question that's been raised by during this webinar that didn't come up in advance but has come up quite a bit today, around if there are any examples of distance learning programs that have been successfully mainstreamed in education systems or outlined in national response plans or in sector plans. And so, Mark, I just wondered if there were any that you could speak to on the UNESCO side in the work you've been doing where you've seen kind of this effective mainstreaming or alignment with national planning.
Well, if we mean in response to the crisis, you know, anyway, what we've seen is people have tried to, you know, to make learning a little more flexible and to provision distance learning to you know, specialized populations. UNESCO is headquartered in France, and in France they have a system called CANED that supports, you know, learners who might have disabilities, who are unable to attend schools, people who are athletes and other things, you know, who have different schedules. And that's a pretty, you know, mature system that's been built over years and years and years. And then in response to the school closures with COVID, they have tried to sort of scale this up to serve the entire, you know, community, entire nation. And obviously that comes with its incumbent challenges. But I think there are definitely examples of where, you know, this has been a somewhat, there was a robust national learning platform of some sort, and there has been a, you know, a concerted effort to use that and leverage it. I mean, some of the examples from China are also, you know, to maintain the continuity of learning there, you know, a massive effort to ensure that and to maintain that sort of structure of students and classes, and to not lose that sort of organizational model. But, you know, it's been interesting. I think that on some sense, most of us, you know, on this call and probably in this meeting, the minute we hear distance learning, we think about, you know, ICT and tech and digital platforms and, you know, mobile networks and things like this. But, you know, it's just to recall that going through the literature, I mean, this has been distance learning a long time ago meant that you got educational materials in the mail and, you know, people completing correspondence classes. I've been to a number of countries, as I'm sure others have. I'm sure Jackie, where, you know, they say the word distance learning and that's what they mean, you know, getting things in the mail and educational materials. So it's just to say we've got a lot of tools in the toolkit, and it's been interesting to see, you know, how many countries I think are quickly realizing that some of the lower tech options around radio broadcasting, television broadcasting are seeming to be, you know, to have to be somewhat effective. Obviously, a lot more needs to be seen on impact. You know, what are people learning? Is it effective? And, you know, we do need that sort of measurement and assessment to be seeing some of that. Anyway, I'll stop there. Hope that answers the question. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, and others making this point that this is perhaps an opportunity, this sort of alignment question of us thinking about those longer term solutions may actually allow us to push for including more children and reaching the most vulnerable, working with national governments to do so. So something for us to bear in mind, I think, in this work. Thank you, Mark. And thank you for raising another great question that actually we were going to come on to, and this is around those no tech solutions. Quite a few have flagged this in the chat and beforehand, and just, you know, we haven't looked in detail at that today, so just an opportunity to hear from panelists of examples of things they might be doing at the moment that don't rely on technology so much. And Luke, I know we touched on this when we caught up last week, so I just wondered if you could jump in again with some of SAVE's work with a more no tech approach.
Yeah, I think it's it can't be overstated enough how important paper is still for distance learning education, which I think Mark laid out pretty well. Save the Children, obviously, we're working in about, you know, over 120 countries. We're working with governments to reposition some of their material from the textbooks into a more child-friendly structure. And then there's also work from our programmatic work, be it on literacy or numeracy and some of the other areas, to build and print, most importantly, large parts of the curriculums that we do, and then deliver them well via the distribution structure is actually more complicated than just going house to house, given some of the restrictions that you're seeing in different parts. But there's a real opportunity to do it in staggered stages if it's safe, to provide engagement with the families to check everything's okay, as opposed to just delivering an entire curriculum and saying, right, there you go, they're fine for the next 3 months. So there is an opportunity there to build in contact points with vulnerable or marginalised children, which can be a real benefit to the paper-based approach or more traditional approaches. Also, there's a lot of work going on with storytelling, songs and so forth, which represent a more traditional, perhaps, form of education and traditional learning material, so they shouldn't be overlooked as well, and the importance of that.
Thanks so much, Luke and Mark, for raising it. It's a really important point. And I know Dean would be encouraging me to stress sort of the safety and health considerations at all time, but just remembering that those, paper-based solutions are still something we should definitely be considering and will help us to continue to reach as many people as possible. So thank you. Again, in the interest of time, moving on to the next question, we've had people raise concerns around this idea that with distance learning, is there a risk that it is very sort of presentation and lecture based, and that we lose some of the important pedagogy that we know is so important for learning? And linked to that, questions around how we can best support and include teachers at this time. So Lauren, I just wondered if I could ask you to jump in here to speak a little bit to that and how we maintain those pedagogical approaches. Thank you.
Yeah, I think for us, we designed a platform with self-paced learning and blended learning in mind. And so for us, while some of the content might appear to be teacher-centered when you have like lectures and that sort of thing, by having something like a learning platform, when you're watching a video, the ability to stop and rewind and go at your own pace and maybe explore some other content that helps to supplement your learning, helps for a more self-directed learning. So for us, I think taking advantages of some of the resources and guidance that a lot of organizations have put out on how to support self-directed learning at home, these additional support to educators. For us, we've been putting together a bank of prompts and mini activities that teachers can share with learners to provide quick check-ins and to be able to do some self-assessment so that learners have agency to be able to direct their own learners. And frankly, I think for us, we're recognizing that from everyone we're talking to, teachers have a strong desire to support, but the ability to, given some of the equity challenges we discussed, is quite challenging. So the more resources we can provide to learners so that they can have their own agency over their own learning experience is critical. And I should just mention, this has generally been our approach in our platform. Educators are called coaches, and in our implementations, like in our connected learning hubs in Jordan with UNHCR and in other places, we have coaches providing support, but the learning experience is driven by the learners.
Thanks, Lauren. I just want to invite any other panelists to jump in, particularly around this question of support to teachers. Anyone want to add there?
Maybe just reiterate what I've said before. I mean, that's built into the Can't Wait to Learn design in any case in different ways. So through Facebook, through Facebook and learners circles, where they come back and actually sort of intervision model between teachers. So that's really, I think, important. I just wanted to jump on this opportunity to talk about sort of feeding into the national curriculum, because that's actually what Can't Wait to Learn is doing in Jordan. It's part of the curriculum, and it's also taught at school. So it can be out of school and in school. And part of the curricula, of course, is certified by the ministries and used.
Great, thank you, Judith. Really appreciate it.
If I can also
Yes, please.
Just very quickly on the teacher front, I know that there's been some good work that's been done as part of the Connected Learning in Crises Consortium to provide instructional design courses for educators, largely looking at tertiary education, but I know some of the partners, including the Carey Institute, have offered webinars and training for teachers on how to support when it comes to distance learning. So these are resources that are both live. There's webinars, and then there's videos that you can see online I'll make sure we share the links, but there's lots of those resources. I think teachers are pivotal to engage in a great resource that we need to utilize as part of our response.
If I could maybe get in something too, teachers obviously being absolutely essential to this, but just to recall that, you know, when the dust settles, and we hope it does soon, you know, this has been a sort of giant crash course for many teachers on how to use digital technologies for learning. I mean, we've been sort of emphasizing, you know, the importance of training and everything, and all of that is indeed important. But as we all know, sort of being forced to do something is a different scenario. I'm sure all of us were not super familiar with Zoom and Microsoft Teams and Skype and everything else, and suddenly these platforms make a lot more sense. So anyway, it's just to hope that ministries of education and others build on the gains that are likely to be made over the next several weeks, if not months, and you know, to continue to make good use of teachers leveraging digital technologies in intelligent and impactful ways.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Great reminder, I think, for us to even in the immediate response still bring that long-term perspective and to build on that. Thank you. Just one more question. I'm conscious of time. Abby, just maybe to come for you, just for a quick response to this one, but a few people have been raising concerns and the challenges around perhaps illiterate households and continuing learning in those contexts. I just wondered, Abby, if you'd mind sharing just a few of your reflections on how we can best support learners in those environments.
Yeah, definitely. You know, I think that we have the advantage of primarily working through mass media, through television and radio. And so there are a couple of things that I would say. One of them is just sort of referring back to what I mentioned earlier about the importance of establishing a sense of self-efficacy among caregivers, you know, that they do know best for their children, that they can support their children's development and their learning in meaningful ways, and that they can participate in their education in meaningful ways, and making sure that educators are sort of cognizant of diversity within the families so that they are equipped to ask the right amount from different families and ask for the right support from different families. The other thing that I would say is that when you can establish an expectation of co-learning, whether that's, you know, co-listening or co-viewing in the example of Sesame, but it could be anything else for whatever folks are doing in terms of distance learning, if you establish an expectation that at least part of that is happening jointly between the caregiver and the child, then I do think that you can actually indirectly and without any stigma support the learning of the caregivers as well, so that the concepts that, you know, you are teaching children can also be picked up by the caregiver in the context of them just supporting their children. And so, you know, we definitely hear lots of anecdotes about what parents learn from Sesame when they watch with their children. And I think that it's important to remember that, you know, when learning is happening in the households, that's happening all the time. You know, certainly parents and caregivers are paying attention and are able to kind of take home some of the lessons that get woven into the content.
Thanks so much, Abby. I'm really conscious of time, everyone. Thank you so much to all the panelists for the discussion. Really meaningful. I'm sorry that we have run out of time. I think this question around learning and assessment has come up very strongly, so I think we'll particularly make sure we follow up on that with our panelists and with all of you. Conscious we did also have additional questions on PSS and SEL. So Camilla, I'm sorry we didn't have time to cover those, but as I say, we are organising a webinar on PSS SEL for next week, and we'll share the invitation for that later today. So given that we are now at our time, I'm going to have to draw things to a close, but I just wanted to, I know these are incredibly challenging times for everyone, so really wanted to thank our panelists and our participants for giving up your time today. We know this is a really important issue in continuing education at the moment, and so here at INEE we're really keen to support in any way we can. We'll continue to explore these interagency coordination efforts around this, and we'll continue to look at our resource collection and also our webinars and blogs and how that can help facilitate and more sharing of tools, resources and solutions at this time. But thank you so much for joining us. I'm hoping that once we close the webinar, you will be sent a form for feedback and suggestions for upcoming webinars, so please also look out for that. But without further ado, thank you everyone. Stay safe at these times, and we'll be in touch very soon.